So recently we've been talking about the estate of Ian Fleming making the potentially devastatingly harmful decision to rewrite certain sections of the James Bond books to make them more palatable for modern audiences. And hopefully this is a decision that they decide to reverse. It's a decision that Penguin decided to reverse when it came to the Roald Dahl books. They actually hired sensitivity readers to go through the Roald Dahl books. They made certain changes prior to publishing the new editions. There was a huge uproar and they ended up reversing that decision. So I thought we'd just spend a couple of minutes talking about sensitivity readers. Who are they? What do they do? Why are they relevant in the age of modern publishing? So stay tuned and we'll talk right about that. Hi guys, it's me and I'm here to talk about sensitivity readers. So as you might be aware, I'm a writer. I'm a successful self-published author. I've sold 68,000 copies of my books, reached 320,000 readers on Kindle Unlimited. And beyond that, I work one-to-one with a lot of authors and help them achieve a certain level of success with their own self-publishing careers. And I've been very good at that. I say I've been very good at that. The authors have been very good at that, and I've helped direct them to be more successful. There are some authors I've worked with who are making hundreds of dollars a month in book sales, and now they're making $15,000, $20,000 a month in book sales. So I'm very good at what I do. And it's worth pointing out that in my business of helping authors be successful, I have worked with sensitivity readers. Sensitivity readers are they're like beta readers. So when you're an author, you write a book, and if there are certain topics that you think might be problematic for audiences, you can hire readers, sensitivity readers, who are readers who have lived experiences or specialist knowledge in particular things, and ask them to read your book and see whether there are any suggestions that they think should be implemented before the book goes live. And you know, it's very easy to say like, oh, sensitivity readers, why are you rewriting stuff? When it comes to older books, that's a different discussion. But when you're an author publishing new books prior to publication, if you are talking about problematic issues, it might be worth hiring a sensitivity reader. They are actually very, very useful. I know a lot of romance writers that I work with have used sensitivity readers to talk about things like domestic violence in their books. If they refer to domestic violence, they don't want anything to trigger readers, so they'll hire a sensitivity reader. When it comes to issues of race, you know, if you're a white writer and you're writing about an interracial relationship or something, sometimes it's worth hiring a sensitivity reader to make sure that you're not saying something that makes you sound like a racist. If you're talking about disability, or you're talking about particular diseases, or any of these issues, losing a child, that's, you know, a lot of romance books, you know, everyone always poo-poos on romance books, but a lot of romance books deal with very serious, very heavy issues. And it is often a good idea to hire somebody to read your book and just give you an outside perspective and a sanity check, so to speak, before you publish it. And I think that's a great thing for books that are in development prior to publication. The problem I have, obviously, and a lot of Bond fans have, and a lot of Roald Dahl fans have, is when you have a book that has been in print for 50 years, 70 years, and you have sensitivity readers look through it to see what might be problematic. Because the problem is, if you wrote something 50 years ago, it's probably going to be problematic. And the most important thing to remember about sensitivity readers is this: if you pay somebody to give your book a sensitivity check, they're going to find something to be sensitive about. You don't pay a sensitivity reader and they take your money and they read your book and they're like, nah, it's fine, go right ahead. They are always going to find something to be sensitive about, and they make suggestions, and then you, as a publisher, are able to decide whether you want to implement these suggestions or not. For the most part, sensitivity readers don't rewrite the books themselves. They just make suggestions, and it's up to the publisher or the author to make those changes. And I think the Roald Dahl books in particular were a really good example of where having sensitivity readers is a really, really bad idea. So the Roald Dahl books, if you're not familiar, Roald Dahl is one of the most beloved children's authors of modern history. He has written, he wrote some of the truly iconic books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and The Great Glass Elevator. My particular favourite, George's Marvellous Medicine. And the problem was these books were written a long time ago. I seem to remember they came out in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so a little bit more modern than Bond, even though Roald Dahl has been writing his whole life. And it was kind of interesting when I heard that Penguin had actually hired sensitivity readers and were making certain changes to the Roald Dahl books, because I've read all the Roald Dahl books. I've read everything Roald Dahl has written. He is a fantastic writer. He is problematic, and that's a subject I might put in to another video at some point. But his books are wonderful. They are wonderful kids' books because they're slightly subversive, and they're slightly twisted, and that works really well for kids. They really, really resonate with young readers. David Williams is a modern writer of children's books, and he's got that same like subversive element that makes his books really, really addictive. I really enjoy reading those to my kids. And so saying that, they are subversive books, but I've read them all, and I've never really spotted anything in them that was particularly like problematic. He didn't have, negative racial depictions. He didn't have, negative, even though Roald Dahl himself said some very anti-Semitic things, his books weren't replete with anti-Semitism. A lot of lefty people were losing their shit over Roald Dahl when it emerged that he'd said these anti-Semitic things, and were like dissecting his books, going through the witches and being like, oh, the witches is anti-Semitic propaganda because the head witch has this long curved nose just like a Jew, and they were really clutching at straws. The fact is, Roald Dahl, he was Norwegian and English. I don't know whether he'd even met somebody who was actually Jewish. So he didn't spend a lot of time writing about Jewish people in his books because they weren't really part of his periphery. All he knew about them was stuff other people had told him, which is why he said some very ignorant things about Jewish people. But there aren't any Jewish people or overtly Jewish people in his books, so his books aren't anti-Semitic. It's a bunch of people who've never read the books before deciding to like project their own insecurities on it. And so when you had these sensitivity readers go through the book and make certain changes, it drove people like me crazy, because the changes they were making were just so stupid. But as I said, if you hire sensitivity readers, they're going to find something to be sensitive about. And the changes they made, like in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you got this character Augustus Gloop, who is described as enormously fat. And the sensitivity readers suggested that they change that to just enormous. Why? Because, modern kids might be offended at being called fat. And here's the thing. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a morality tale. And being fat isn't a positive thing. You should not bully people who are fat. In this day and age, with our crappy diet and stuff like that, there are an awful lot of kids who are fat. Augustus Gloop wasn't fat. He was enormously fat. He was a glutton. That's the whole point. He was abnormally fat, but he was, and that's the thing. If you describe him as just enormous, he could be huge. He could be fucking ripped. He could be Arnold Schwarzenegger sitting through there. No, he was enormously fat, as in he ate too much and he was gluttonous. And, that small detail is so important to what the character is and the morality of it. And it's just so ignorant when a sensitivity reader suggests you change that at the risk of offending fat kids out there. And it's even more ignorant for Penguin to have actually considered making those changes. But there was a lot of ignorance involved in the whole thing of hiring sensitivity readers for the Roald Dahl books, for two reasons. First of all, the sensitivity readers that they picked, it's a British company called Inclusive Minds. And Inclusive Minds is, how could you call it? They go on about wanting, they have inclusion ambassadors, and they want authentic representation in books and things like that, which is fine. When we're talking, as I said, about modern books, about if you're an author writing a book and you want to make sure that it's inclusive, these are important things. A company like Inclusive Minds is a great person to go to. But when you have an older book and you get a group like Inclusive Minds in, it's going to cause problems because older books are written in a slightly more robust way. And also, a company like Inclusive Minds has a very clear agenda. If you actually look at they had, what is it, the woke, oh no, what is it? It's terrible dailymail.co.uk article, and the Daily Mail is trash. So let's not read too much into it. But they described the consultants from Inclusive Minds as being aged between 8 to 30, which, to be honest, is fine. If you're looking at children's books, that's an appropriate age spectrum, led by a non-binary, asexual, polyamorous relationship anarchist who is on the autism spectrum. And all of those things are fine. I have nothing against anybody who describes themselves in those ways. But if they describe themselves in those ways, then how they read a book is through a very particular lens. And it's not particularly a general lens. I mean, if you sit there and describe yourself as non-binary, asexual, polyamorous relationship anarchist who is on the autism spectrum, there are certain things that, you are very clearly... that are very clearly important to you, that might not necessarily be relevant or important to a broader audience. And I think that's why so many people, when they learned about the changes that were being made to the Roald Dahl books, were just like, what? Because they were stupid changes. Because Inclusive Minds had approached editing the Roald Dahl books with a kind of agenda. They were being paid to find things. They were being paid for a sensitivity reading, so therefore, they were going to come up with things to be sensitive about. It was just a very cynical, twisted, misguided thing to approach the Roald Dahl books, almost like with an agenda before you even start. So I'm really pleased that Penguin reversed that decision. But the other thing I want to talk about is the irony of it all. I said Roald Dahl's books didn't actually have that much in them that would offend even modern sensibilities. If you're talking about the James Bond books actually using the N-word, and then you have the Roald Dahl books describing a child as enormously fat. It's like these two things are not the same. And secondly, the thing that it is, going through the Roald Dahl books and changing things like, oh, the kid was enormously fat, is so asinine, because it's not little descriptions like that make the Roald Dahl books problematic or delightful, depending on your opinion. As I said, my favourite book is George's Marvellous Medicine. When was George's Marvellous Medicine first published? It was first published in 1981. I remember reading this the first time. And it's a book about this kid called George, and he's stuck at home with his grandma, who is a complete harridan. And every day, George has to give his grandma medicine. And I think he spills the medicine. And so he's like, oh, what am I going to do? I've spilled the medicine. She's going to yell at me. So he decides to go around the house and make her some new medicine. And so he goes to the kitchen and he gets like washing up liquid and dish soap, and he goes and puts paint in it, and it goes around the house and puts all sorts of things that, if you actually drank them, would probably kill you. And the really interesting thing, this was written in the 80s, and so there is a section where George is going around the house, finding all sorts of things to put in his marvellous medicine. He's got a big saucepan on the oven, and he's just pouring them in there. And he goes to the medicine cabinet. And Roald Dahl had actually clearly listened to, the sensibilities of people in the 80s. And he has a section in it where he's like, George knew that he shouldn't he shouldn't take medicine or give medicine to other people unless it was the medicine that was prescribed to them, because that could be very dangerous and that could kill them. So there was like this little section in which Roald Dahl pointed out to kids, hey, it's all very well to mix your grandma up some new medicine with like paint and washing up liquid and stuff in there, but don't give people real human medicine. You could make them sick. And I remember at that time remembering that. I was like, oh, Mum, Dad, we can't give people human medicine if they don't have it prescribed to them, because that could make them sick. Of course, George then runs off to the barn and gets all the animal medicine and puts it in there, which kind of undermines the sensibilities of that. But it's interesting how when Roald Dahl wrote this, he was actually sensitive to things people might get upset about. But the whole point of the book is George making this crazy medicine out of stuff that would probably poison and kill his grandma, and then feeding it to her, and unexpected things happen. I don't think this is a very realistic in realistic rendition of what might happen if you feed your grandma medicine made of all sorts of random things in your house. I don't think it would end on with the the way it's written, but it is a completely bonkers subversive book, which is based around a kid doing something that is inherently subversive and dangerous. And so the whole idea of having sensitivity readers go through and change a couple of words of it when it's a book about a kid poisoning his grandma is just so stupid and asinine. And that's what people get upset about. It's almost become like a cultural war, you know. There are people like me, tedious middle-aged white guys, being like, oh, you shouldn't change the James Bond books. And there are people on the left being like, oh, this is the modern age. We can't have things that are going to offend people. When if you actually take a step back and look at the bigger picture, you realize just how dumb this whole debate is. And even in that, you know, the difference between the Roald Dahl books and the James Bond books is the Roald Dahl books are aimed at children. And the estate of Roald Dahl really do want to make these children's books continue to be available for new generations of children because they are timeless books. They are still beloved best-selling children's books. So there is a commercial reason that makes sense for Penguin to have actually like explored sensitivity changes for these books. For the James Bond books, no. It's just stupid. It is just a stupid decision to try and rewrite certain sections to avoid upsetting people because, I mean, the James Bond books are lurid adventure stories. That's what they're meant to do. Anyway, I digress. But it is worth pointing out that sensitivity readers are real, that there are very valid reasons why sensitivity readers could be people that you would want to read your book. As I say, it's more for books that are being written now, that books are in development. Even a company like Inclusive Minds, you know, it's all very well for the Daily Mail and New York Post to be like, oh, they're woke consultants and, you know, they're all a bunch of lefties. You know, that's their agenda just as much as the Inclusive Minds had their own agenda when they were trying to sensitivity cleanse Roald Dahl's books. So if you can step back and try not to have an agenda, you can see why a company like Inclusive Minds exists and the positive things that it can do. And you can see why Penguin maybe were motivated to explore making changes to the books. I'm very pleased they reversed that. I don't see why the estate of Ian Fleming would make that decision. I think it's very misguided, but it's just worth looking at all of the different elements from taking a step back and taking your own emotions out of it and looking at it a bit more objectively. So I think the fact is, with older books, you are never going to be able to, you can't change them to be more suitable for modern audiences because books are a reflection of the period in which they were written. And if you do that, you dilute what it is that book is and what that book represents. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was written, I think, in the 60s, and that was a morality tale with like 60s morality. George's Marvelous Medicine, it was a really fun story that really resonated with me as a kid growing up in the 80s because we did mischievous stuff like that. But I can understand this book couldn't be written today, but it could be written then, and it was written then, and it still exists. Hopefully this one is still in print. This is an incredibly subversive book. I hope if you have kids who are like under the age of 12 or something, you go out tomorrow and buy them this book and make them read it because they'll love it, because they'll be like, what? George is making this medicine? That will probably kill his grandma. Let's read more. That's why the books are good and exciting, and that's why you want to read them. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I just thought it was worth having a chat about sensitivity readers and sensitivity in general, because it's an issue that we need to stamp on right now. There are various issues going on in the battlefield of culture at the moment, and this whole thing of trying to sanitize older books is one front of this battle, and it's one front that needs to be won by common sense. So we need to stop trying to sanitize and change old books. Just leave them the hell alone. Leave them the way they were written. Anyway, that's me with my little rant over. I'll be back very soon with another video. Until then, remember to sign my petition if you haven't already, for them not to change the James Bond books. The link's going to be down below. Thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon. Cheers. I'm Roland Hume. I've sold 67,000 copies of my books. If you want to find out how I did it, I've got the link right here you can click. And otherwise, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more videos coming soon. Thank you.